people, which is Maspika, which comes from the fact that many of those people, came from that part of Africa, brought here to work on the farms. And so we see the coinciding of these, some of them Muslim, some non-Muslim, of African slaves, Southeast Asian slaves in a minority, as well as a number of Indian slaves as well, with many of these political exiles as well. And around this period, building on the work of, I'm not sure how many people know about Mr. Ibrahim Roda, he wrote about Strand, but he formulated that Twanguru in Buka actually sent out deputies as da'is to give da'wah, further into the peninsula and into the colony at the time. And so in Strand there was Imam Abdul Samad, in what was Deep River there was Ahmad van Makassar, the forefather of Imam Yasin Harris. Even in Simonstown people were sent out. But we don't have any written records of who was sent to this area of Claremont and Newlands. And the only evidence that we know that people were here is through the names of Muslims popping up in that period. And so when we look at some of the census records, we see some very familiar names popping up. We see a name like Slamdin popping up, was an individual that endowed this masjid. We see a name Asya popping up. I'm not sure if the descendants know, but Asya was the father of another individual named Kamaldin, who is the forefather of the Kamaldin family. Another individual named Ontom, the father of someone named Topi, who is the forefather of the Topi family. And we can see in the 1820s, many of these different people, popping up as free slaves among that community. And slowly you start to have, a taste of a community being born. And, we don't have any evidence of a maqbara or a masjid at the time. However, we know the practice of the Muslims at the time was to establish something called a langar. I know many of the older Buddhas and Tikis over here will remember what the langar is. It's like a little salah before an actual masjid was established. And so, I am very sure that there was actually a langar that was established in this area. And, around 20 years later, in the 1840s, by the time when all of the enslaved people were free, you start to see that those very same slaves built themselves up to earn some money, whether it's through perekat or it was through masonry, or they were painters, they were sculptors, they were wood carvers, through their trades, they built themselves up to make some money. And you see that many of these people start to either purchase land or granted land in exchange for some of their trades. And this is particularly when we see a very prominent individual in the records known as Ago van de Kaap or Ajo van de Kaap starting to pop up. And he's granted quite a large proportion of land in the Samsusi area, which is the school is still there, but this larger area or farm was known as Samsusi. And this Ajo van de Kaap, later on we find out that his actual name was Ajohar, and he's the forefather of the Ajohar family. And from a very old Mesam tombstone that we found in the Kubus over there, there was one that described him as Sheikh Ajohar. So we don't know much about the leadership and the formation of the Muslim community in that period, but here we see some evidence that Ajohar himself, Ajo van de Kaap, was actually the leader, the imam, the sheikh of this very early budding community of freed slaves that rose out of this area. And around that same period, Slamdin's brother Samai, a very prominent carriage man, he was the horse and cart driver for the famous astronomer Herschel. He was granted property, as well as their third brother Kamis also became quite prominent, and he settled up in Makassar itself, the famous Daris and Kamis family over there. And so it was these three brothers, Asya that I mentioned. There was also an individual named Badruddin, someone named Fakhruddin, and some of the early Muslims that started to take transfer of property in the area. And it's from that time that we also see the establishment of two main features, that highlight community in the area, or established community, and that is a masjid and a maqbara. And so in terms of the masjid, the very first masjid that went up in this area was this masjid. In 1849, Slamdin himself had purchased this property. By 1850, it was already being built. 1851, the masjid was built. And only in 1854, 170 years ago, was that trust document drawn up with Imam Rashid reference that Imam Abdul Rauf of Baitul Street Masjid was made the trustee of the masjid. But even before that, in the around 1850, the space was already being used as a masjid at that time. At the same time, the same slum bin also owned property on that side of what is now the railway, and he endowed what was a maqbara. And so one of the earliest maqbaras is the old Baker Street maqbara. I'm not sure how many old Claremont residents can remember that there used to be a kubus on that ground over there, which is where many of the older families, the slum bins, even some of the Abderofs and older families were buried, as well as across next to the Stefan Road Masjid, which is still being used today. And those are just two kubuses or maqbaras in the area. There were another 3 in the surrounding area. I'm not sure how many are aware that even on Rondebosch Common, there was a maqbara that was endowed at the same time in 1854. There was a maqbara in Newlands, just off Newlands Avenue, and there were quite a number in this area, which highlight the prominence, specifically of Muslims that they had in the area, and the effect that they had, in this area as a community. And we even see from, municipal documents that, the municipality themselves admitted that it was the Muslim community, as they termed the Malays, that ensured that, Newlands, Claremont, even Wynberg was turned into such a cosmopolitan and mercantile area, a lot of different shops, because of this very Muslim community at the time. And from that Ajuhad, as I mentioned, one of his daughters married the son of another freed slave from Buka by the name of Harun Baqia, and that is actually the ancestor, the forefather of Imam Harun himself. So I find it quite fitting that Imam Harun, is the descendant, direct descendant of one of the very first imams of this masjid. And I think after the masjid, was established and the maqbaras were established, most of the history had been written up, recorded in the book, the history of Claremont. And I think from then on, most of us, are familiar with how the history progressed over time.
I'm sure Dayan has given you a little taste of his talent. When the Maqbara at Stefan Road, we reopened it. I must not say this, but Dayan went there and saved some of the tombstones as Unasekwe. And he deciphers the names of people. This is the kind of passion that he has, and we wish, inshallah, we pray in good health.
Amen.
And many more of our young people to come up, because this history has not even been written. It's a lot that needs to be done in terms of archiving, in terms of discovering the history of this particular area. Our next speaker is going to be Professor Aslam Battar. Aslam Battar is a distinguished professor of sociology of education at Stellenbosch University, prolific author, and most importantly, a long-standing and senior member of the Claremont Main Road Masjid. Imam Shahid and I are grateful for Aslam's support in enriching our Imamat roles. He will speak about a tribute to our predecessor, Imam Hassan Solomon al-Marhum.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. And when one listens to presentations like this, the one thing, the responsibility that comes up, making a very general point, is to endow some kind of a scholarship to have this thing studied properly. It costs you about R1 million to have this studied properly. And I'm suggesting that that is something to think about, including myself. I'm going to truncate, it's a kort praat, van Imam Hassan Solomon al-Marhum. And I'm going to start by saying the following things. That we are living in al-Am al-Huzn, in a year of trauma, in a year of genocide, global genocide. And I want to reference the year 620, when the Prophet ﷺ experienced Am al-Huzn. That is the year of sorrow and trauma. And he experienced why? Because he came under the persecution at its height of the context in which he lived. And his wife, his beloved wife Khadija, to whom he was married for 25 years until her age of 50, and she passed away. Subhanallah, his psycho-affective and emotional context was from under him, because this was the woman who was the first Muslim who assured the Prophet that when he received wahi, that he is the Prophet of Islam. The second thing happened in that year, and that is his benefactor, his lineage benefactor Abu Talib passes away. And when your lineage benefactor passes away in the Jahiliyyah times, you are left unmoored, unprotected, because Abu Talib and the lineage that they belong to could offer the Prophet some protection when the Prophet delivered a message that was really ripping the community's moral or immoral foundations apart and began to threat to them. And then he died. What happened after that? Just very soon after that, Al-Mi'raj and Isra. In the moment of trauma, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala confers on Prophet the blessing on Mi'raj. In other words, the answer to the trauma is the connection via the salah, via our worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the story that we've heard, we can hear how these people in clandestine, the underground, and sometimes on ground established their commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to this community, to life. That's my first point. My second point, telescope to 1979 and between 1979 and 1985. Imam Hassan Solomons was appointed as the Imam of this masjid. And he went on in 5 or 6 very short years in this masjid to leave us a legacy worthy of exploration and emulation. What was that legacy? Let me give you some markers of that legacy for it, and then I'll come back and explain what that all means. Firstly, in 1983, in August 1983, Imam Hassan is a speaker at the launch of the United Democratic Front in Rocklands. There he spoke with people like Alan Bushra to launch the United Democratic Front. And what was the United Democratic Front? At that point it had said that we are confronting the depth and the brutality of apartheid out of the 60s and 70s and 80s. The answer in response is to develop a multi-front, multi-faith, multi-group alliance to fight against the oppressive apartheid regime, and all those leaders who had fought, who had been participating in that, were utterly and absolutely heroic, because they had to not just confront the apartheid state, but they also had to confront their own communities. So, at the same time confronting the apartheid state, and at the same time confronting their own communities who had, out of the repression of the 60s and 70s, lapsed into the, I'm going to use a harsh word, complacency. And some even participating in the quietness in the apartheid struggle. Imam Hassan emerges in that context, and he becomes a fountainhead for a burning spotlight, for articulating, for giving words to the anti-apartheid struggle from an Islamic perspective, from the mimbar of Claremont Main Road Masjid, where I in 1982 at first listened to him. And I thought to myself, subhanAllah, I'm in the student struggle. I have been experimenting with communist and Marxist ideas, and here I was listening to someone speaking into that anti-apartheid realm from an Islamic perspective. كُونُوا قَوَّامِينَ بِالْقِسْطِ شُهَدَاءَ لِلَّهِ. When you listen to this ayat, when Imam spoke it here, rise up and bear witness to justice. When you heard that in that Islamic Quranic language, it hit your heart so very hard that it fueled you going forward. Another event, and there were many, but I'm going to now truncate, is when Imam in 1985, now he is 83, he joins the anti-apartheid struggle as a leader. He has established an anti-Islamic Muslim position, and he is now on the run. For his family comes under pressure. He's never really at home. He is hidden in various homes in Hanover Park, in Surrey Estate, and so on and so forth. Why? Because they are now being pursued by the police. And in that very fateful day, Eid al-Adha, 1985, Imam Hassan was intent on, because he was also very adventurous, that's what I was told. He was intent on delivering the Eid al-Adha khutbah from this member. No one was going to deter him from that, because that was where he needed to pronounce on Islam and their commitment to the anti-apartheid Islam in the very depth of the battle against apartheid. So he delivers the khutbah. And then, the story must all be told. I only have a bit of the story. He escapes. He escapes apparently out of the window. I don't know which window. Some says the top window. I don't know which window. This window here. There is a decoy that gets set up. The decoy is his brother on a motorbike who goes up that way, and the police chases the brother. He escapes out of the window. Brothers and sisters, Rata for instance. And then he lands up in a getaway car driven by the wonderful Riyad Najjar, the principal. And they take him away to one of his brother's homes, where he stays for a little while in a pigeon loft. Now, of course, they say that Imam Hassan also cultivated pigeons and or maybe he stayed behind the pigeon loft. And then from there, he is spirited out of the country. And he is driven up to Botswana. And then he moves into Saudi Arabia and so on. Can we imagine the sheer danger, the sheer adventure in the commitments that you make when you make it, the consequences that you have to account for when you make those commitments, and the life that you must live, with the consequences for family, with the consequences for community, and the consequences for congregation. That was my second point. I've got 2 more points, Imam. Now, wat gaan die aan? Waar kom die imam vandaan, gewoon imam? Let's telescope back. You start telling the story of colonialism, of the Khoi period, and so on, of his forefathers. That all plays a role in the practices that establishes him serendipitously, his family and so on. His family lands up in a particular way, in the way described in Constantia, and they become, in the context of huzn, in the context of trauma, they become, under those limiting conditions, the most beautifully flourishing community of inter-collaboration, of cooperation, of love across the color line in all kinds of ways, and of establishing entrepreneurship on their farm, a flourishing farm, out of which they sell produce, they sell flowers, they sell all related kinds of products from that particular farm. And the Solomon's family then, therefore, under those conditions, started. 1967 happens, and 1967 rips all of that, introducing sorrow, trauma into that particular community, but galvanizing the consciousness of Imam Hassan. Imam Hassan would have gone to Constantia Primary School, it will allow me another few minutes, then he goes to South Peninsula, then he goes to UCT, he doesn't complete immediately, he goes to UNISA, he goes to Pentec where he learns about textiles and clothing, he goes back at some point again to UCT where he then completes. He then gets exposed to the world of ideas, to the world of the unity movement at SP, for example, and in the politics of Cape Town, which is fundamentally unity movement, to the politics of the PAC, and to the politics of the ANC, a little bit like Imam Haoun, obviously, to the influences of the young people who were swirling around him and were his mates. Abu Bakr Fakir being probably the most important intellectual person of that time, whom we also have to, as part of this project, whose life we have to research. And to Ibrahim Bardin, and to Yusuf da Costa, and so on and so forth. So he swam in those waters. He joins Sanzak. He gets sort of tilted and educated by his brother Sheikh Tariq Khalil to become an imam, when he does become an imam in 1979, for which he is entirely or mostly unprepared. Right? This was a masjid that 2 safs for Jumu'ah. Right? Imam Rashid becomes the Qari and the Hafiz of Quran who leads the Tarawih Salah after his sojourn in prison and his sort of marginalization from the mainstream Sultan of the community. He ends up here. And Imam Rashid and Imam Hassan become partners in arms. Imam Rashid, the beautiful Qari, and Imam Hassan, the beautiful orator. So that was what I remember most powerful from Imam Hassan. His beautiful oratory, soft-spoken person, but when you give him a microphone or a stage, his voice comes to life and he articulates a vision of the world and was comparing. So what was that vision? Third point. His vision was, my respected brothers and sisters, non-racialism and anti-racism. Drawn from the life of the Prophet ﷺ and the example of Bilal, and the inspiration of the death of Imam Abdullah Harun. Cooperation and interfaith as the cornerstone of the anti-apartheid struggle that he joined Not isolation and ideological bigotry and framing that one and that one as the other. No, every single human being. This was also the vision of the UDF and the ANC, multi-party, multi-racial, non-racialism. Everyone is potentially your friend. And isn't that what we currently need in the solidarity struggles against the Zion, the decrepit, the barbaric Zionists? That's solidarity. Solidarity. What did we have here 2 Fridays ago? The Jewish folks were excommunicated from their religion. Was their story from their dad. They came here and celebrated their Shabbos. This is the second time that they did it. That directly comes out of the intellectual and into the qalb process of Imam Hassan Solomon in the 1980 moment. And we have to honor it. We have to honor it. We call it today by a word, progressive Islam. We call it today by a word, Islamic liberation theology. He didn't have that language for it. But he had a pure and unadulterated descriptive language for motivating people to become part in the struggle for justice. Justice against oppression. And so my final point is this. What is the responsibility for us as a Jama'ah and as a community today? I have recently become part of the establishment of the Imam Hassan Solomon's Foundation. And we are asking one question. If Imam Hassan pivoted, why did he pivot to the anti-apartheid struggle in the context in which pivoting was an anachronism, the stay in geweest, you got sort of cut off from the community. On what basis did he pivot and why? Now, 40 years later, 50 years later, what are the challenges that we have to pivot towards? The Imam Hassan Solomon's Foundation is answering that question. And it's not going to be an answer because we're going to give lectures, necessarily. But it's an answer to begin to understand what world we currently live in. Having just gone through Al-Am al-Huzn, genocidal year, where the Zionist barbarians have decimated any sense of what they, any sense of the humanity of the Palestinians. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله واستغفروه إنه
I know Assam has written his entire speech, so we asked him to maybe edit it and publish it somewhere so that we can read and reflect more about it. I also want to acknowledge that we have Imam Hassan's son, Nasser. Nasser is here. Nasser, we are so grateful for your father. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant him a high place in Al-Jannah. As I stand on the shoulders of your father, because of him, I was given the opportunity to make the khutbah, and he nurtured so many of us. And I'm so glad that I can announce that someone is writing a book about his life. So these are really unsung heroes. So we now come to a very special part of our program. And I'd like to call upon the Secretary of the Claremont Bangalore Masjid Board of Governors, Jamia Khalan, to speak to us about this very special part of our program. Shukran, Jamia.